Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Carnage. I tried to get to this review before the Black Friday sales ended, but I couldn't really get to it in time. I did a kind of tier list stream to give people an idea of just how much better he is, but Carnage's uniform came out at the same time as Knull's and was largely overshadowed just because of the hype around Knull and how powerful he is. Regardless, the new uniform for Carnage is a definite upgrade, not only for his performance in PvE, if you decide to use him kind of as a hybrid or to push certain stages of War Boss Legend, but also for PvP. The main improvement on the uniform for PvP revolves around the 5th skill. It's now been loaded up with all of the key stats that you want for PvP, similar to Wolverine's 5th skill, where once the skill activates, he basically just deletes opponents. And similar to Wolverine's 5th skill, it is an iframe ignore skill, meaning that the AI will open with it and provide you with all of those crazy benefits that the skill has, as well as just a massive amount of burst damage. It has 100% damage proc on it, and on top of that, it also provides invincible, 90% penetration to all sources, healing, and is an iframe skill in itself, meaning that it also provides you with survivability, with that invincible also going off. It's also worth noting that the 5th skill now has super guard break penetration on it, meaning that he will lock down the opponent while he's bursting them down, and with this new uniform, his striker skill has been upgraded from the 2nd skill, which was largely useless, to the amazing 5th skill, which makes him one of the top striker options for PvP, considering that you get iframe ignore, super guard break penetration, regular penetration, and a damage proc when that striker skill activates on a character's tier 4 skill. His survival has also improved, with the 4th and 5th skill being full iframe skills, and the 3rd skill also providing a heal on top of the 5th skill that he spams from the healing there. Keep in mind that all the testing I did with Carnage is with a brilliant CTP of Greed in PvE and mostly in PvP. I do also test out a brilliant CTP refinement just to compare between the Greed and see how he does with an offensive build versus a defensive build. If you want to build Carnage solely for PvE, I would say that you could use a CTP of Energy or Destruction because he is fairly proc friendly, but he'll probably be a lot easier to play with a CTP of Rage, especially when you have your ultimate, since you often need to delay cancel that going into the 3, 4, and 5 skills. You have to keep in mind that the 3rd skill is damage accumulation for damage taken, meaning that oftentimes you don't want to rush right past the 3rd skill, and you'll probably activate your proc if you're using an energy or destruction, which is why a CTP of Rage is likely more ideal. The 4th and 5th skill are iframe skills, meaning that you won't really take damage, and is the reason why you want to stay in the 3rd skill a little bit longer. If you want more of a middle ground or hybrid build, more so leaning into PvP than PvE, then a CTP of Greed is a decent option there. You'll have the character built basically ideally for PvP, but can also leverage the proc in PvE and try to push through some higher stages of War Boss Legend if you don't have too many combat fill-in characters. The rotation I used for Carnage is to do a quick cancel of the 1st and 2nd skill to fill up the tier 3 and tier 4 faster, then the main rotation being 3, cancel 4, cancel 5. When you have your ultimate skill, you use that first and delay cancel it after you see him go up in the air and the spikes start to rain down. Then you immediately do the same rotation again of 3, cancel 4, cancel 5. If you want to make the damage more ideal, I would recommend trying to time the 3rd skill and waiting a little bit before canceling it, so that you can actually accumulate some damage and have more spike damage overall. With the new uniform, I'm able to complete stage 39 of Kang with 2 supports and a leadership with around 2 minutes and 20 seconds remaining. With the old uniform, I complete the same stage with around 2 minutes and 5 seconds remaining, which is roughly around 15 to 20 seconds slower, but I already completed the stage pretty quickly as is, so I did do another World Boss Legend test that took a little bit longer or was tougher just to get a better assessment of the upgrade. So looking at stage 19 now of Corvus and Proximus World Boss Legend stage, and only using Agent Venom as a support, I was able to clear this with roughly around 20 seconds remaining with the old uniform. With the new uniform and the exact same setup, I'm able to complete this stage 50 seconds faster, which gives you a better representation of the improvement the uniform provides, but you also have to take this with a grain of salt since I am using a CTP of Greed, and it's kind of a little bit chaotic or RNG to be able to predict the proc or line it up. So in some cases it might be faster, a little bit slower in other cases, but for the most part you can see that the new uniform is a definite upgrade. At least if you're using him in World Boss Legend, it will be at least anywhere from 20 seconds to 40 or 50 seconds faster than the previous uniform. Even though Carnage satisfies certain restrictions for ABX and ABL, considering that he is human, combat, and villain, so he can be used for several different days, I don't think that the character will really be used for the most part in Alliance Battle Extreme or Alliance Battle Legend, mostly because he doesn't have the high number of hits that some of the other characters now have, and because his third skill is based off damage taken in terms of the accumulation, as opposed to damage dealt, meaning that for the most part you're not really going to fill that up since you don't really take damage in Alliance battle modes. He's also missing a bunch of cancel effects for the different seasons, but regardless, if you were wondering how he does, with that CTP of Greed I was able to score close to 12 million in ABX, but like I mentioned, there are going to be better options now for either ABX or ABL. The most significant improvement for Carnage is going to be seen in PvP, not only in Alliance Conquest and Otherworld Battle, but the character is now good enough to be used in Timeline and is arguably in the top 5 options, considering ban lists and whichever other characters that you're facing off against or potential supports that you're using, because Carnage has access to Agent Venom support, and because Knull is in the meta currently, then it kind of makes sense that you would want to potentially use either Carnage or Silver Surfer, meaning that he is potentially in the top 5 for PvP and Timeline, since you can pair him with Agent Venom. You can see from these clips that even when I'm not using Agent Venom support, that Carnage can hold his own, but I would say that largely he is kind of on par with Wolverine, but I would say that Wolverine is still slightly ahead of Carnage because he has higher priority with his 5th skill, so Wolverine can open faster, and because the 5th skill for Wolverine is a longer duration and a shorter cooldown, it means that he can lock down the opponent for a longer period of time and use that 5th skill more often than Carnage can. But once you take supports into consideration, and especially because Carnage can leverage Agent Venom, Carnage does end up pulling a bit ahead of Wolverine, and you can see that in this clip. The previous fight I ended up losing versus Adam Warlock, but in this one he easily ended up winning. In terms of the build options, the ones that I tested were a CTP of Greed and a CTP of Refinement. For Timeline specifically, and when you're not using supports, it seems that a CTP of Greed does make him a bit fragile, and I did actually end up losing this fight that I tested out here at the start. So in the next one, I actually ended up switching to a CTP of Refinement to see how it would compare in terms of his survival and ability to just take out the whole team. It did perform better, so it kind of suggests, and from the other tests that I did, that going kind of with a survival based build and no supports seems to be more ideal if you're using him in Timeline. So a CTP of Refinement does have a little bit of an edge over a CTP of Greed in that case. Keep in mind that these are the results I found when you're not using supports on the team. When you do end up using supports with Carnage, the overall performance does change. It seems that both a CTP of Greed and a CTP of Refinement are equally viable, and it largely comes down to preference, and in terms of his performance versus the opponent, it depends on the opponents you're facing, their builds, and their teams in terms of which CTP will come out on top. You saw in that last clip that with the CTP of Refinement and without a support that I was able to survive longer versus this team, even though I still ended up losing. And in this test, I just added in a support. I didn't change anything else. The build is the same, and Carnage was able to fully beat this team using the exact same build and just adding in the support for additional survival. To see how it compares, I did the exact same test with the support, but this time switched out the CTP of Refinement for a CTP of Greed. I was still able to beat this team just like with the Refinement. I actually beat them quicker with this one, but I still ended up actually triggering his Immortal artifact in both instances, even with the refinement in the previous fight and with the CTP of Greed in this fight. So overall, the performance is largely the same. The only real difference between these two builds, I would say, is that you're probably a little bit more susceptible to reflect initially with this build if the opponent is using something like Silver Surfer, but in the long run, once you end up proccing the top proc of the CTP of Greed, you will become immune to reflect and won't really have that as a problem. Even though CTP refinement doesn't provide you with any direct protection against reflect, because the character doesn't have as much burst damage, you don't really have to worry about reflect as much, especially considering that Carnage's main damage comes from an iframe skill, so he's going to be hidden in an iframe and not really going to be able to take reflect damage back. But if you are worried about that, you can potentially go with Greed, or if you want to have the same kind of survival almost as a refinement, but also have that reflect protection, you can also go with the CTP of Conquest and kind of get the best of both worlds in a sense between the Greed and the CTP of Refinement. But from my personal testing, I found that either going fully offensive or fully kind of survival seems to be the most ideal option for Carnage. Even though I think a CTP of Refinement is likely more ideal for timeline, especially if you're playing manual, for people who have difficulty taking out some of the big metas like Knull, for example, and the opponent just ends up stacking a lot of supports on Knull, potentially even 2 supports on him, then a CTP of Greed on Carnage might be kind of a better option, considering that you have that top proc that will activate, especially because you have the immortality effect, that will allow you to bypass all of the damage reduction that the opponent stacks up, so you will be able to at least take out one life of the big meta, or potentially even both of them. If you want to know how to face off versus Carnage, you basically just want to lock him down. If you see that the top proc is about to activate on the opponent, you can just move away to avoid either the 5th or 4th skill and just resume kind of burning down his health and activating that artifact, or killing him if you've already done so. This is another reason why I mentioned that Carnage isn't exactly on the same level as Wolverine. Wolverine is still a little bit better, I would say, overall, but it kind of changes around once you start adding those supports. But the reason that I mentioned that Wolverine is a little bit better is because Wolverine tracks you with his 5th skill, whereas Carnage doesn't really do that. So if you're facing off versus him on auto, he's not as big of a hassle to deal with as Wolverine is, for example. You can just kind of move away from the big skills that you know are coming. In terms of playing Carnage on manual in PvP, you largely want to use the 5th skill whenever you have it available, so that you get the invincible, healing, the penetration, everything from it, and try to either burn down the opponent's artifact or immortal, or potentially kill them. From there, you basically want to go into the 4th skill because it is a full iframe skill and does AoE damage, so even if the opponent knocks you out of it, you'll still end up burning down their health. You can use the 3rd skill whenever available, but try to immediately cancel that so you just get the damage accumulation from it, because it doesn't provide you with any protection like an iframe, and you largely just want to do the damage from the 5th and 4th skill. In Alliance Conquest, if you don't plan on using Agent Venom with Carnage, say you want to use him for Silver Surfer or Knull instead, then I would still recommend that you pair Carnage with a support. He largely seems to perform better since he can more often go into his burst skill and his healing, potentially even go into his tier 4 skill because of that immortality effect. So some potential supports that improve his survivability that you might want to consider are Shuri, M'Baku, Sleeper, or potentially even Colossus if you're not using him elsewhere. And then for the 3rd option, just add in another good meta character. I find that Spider-Man is a decent option since it protects Carnage versus any kind of blast types that they might want to use. In this next test, I actually decided to use Agent Venom to see just how big of a meta team Carnage is able to take, and you can see that with the new uniform, he can kind of consistently either wipe out or fully win against a Sentry, Wolverine, and Colossus team like I did in this test. If you're looking for some good counters versus Carnage, I would say that the best one is likely Ghost Rider. Like I mentioned before, Carnage's 5th skill does have a little bit of a delay on it because it isn't as high priority as some other skills, meaning that Ghost Rider can open with his own skill first and burst down a Carnage, even one that has 2 supports, activating the artifact and then living long enough to be able to take out Carnage fully before he can do the same to him. So basically, if you didn't get Carnage's latest uniform with the Black Friday sales, I would still recommend that you pick him up, especially now that Knull is in the meta and a lot of people are using Agent Venom on their team in Timeline, meaning that you can either use Carnage or Silver Surfer on that team. And if you want kind of a character that is a little bit more burst damage oriented and you're kind of not relying on Reflect as much as Silver Surfer, then Carnage is definitely a good go-to. And also, especially if the opponent is using 2 supports, you can use Carnage with a CTP of Greed and kind of bypass some of that damage reduction to be able to burst them down if you're having trouble there. If you're not really worried about using him in Timeline, I'd say that a CTP of Refinement is definitely a solid choice as well, especially for things like Otherworld Battle and Alliance Conquest, since you can actually leverage that CTP for once, considering that Carnage has Guard Break immunity built in, and he seems to perform pretty well with it, considering that he has a high amount of damage reduction with supports and can constantly heal with the heal spam from his 5th skill and his other skills. It's kind of unfortunate that Carnage arrived in the same update as Knull, since he largely got overshadowed, and a lot of people would likely be talking about his meta upgrade if Knull wasn't in the picture, but regardless, he is a great upgrade nevertheless, and is definitely worth picking up if you're into PvP. I'm not really sure what's going on with the next update. It seems that Sharon Rogers is getting another uniform, and that potentially Crescent will get a tier 4, considering that she was on that poll for characters that were going to get upgrades before the year is done, probably Emma and Medusa as well. But I'm going to be on vacation and going to be doing holiday stuff, so I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to be covering this stuff. If I do, it's likely going to be at least a week or a little bit more than that late, so yeah, we'll see what happens with that. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining or useful, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others if you can. It might help them out and definitely helps my channel grow. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.